That was just a quick introduction to Ireland, probably aimed at American tourists. Nevertheless, still an exploratory overview. In this lecture, we are firstly going to consider how Irish nationalists used ideas of the past to justify their political cause, relative to Hobsbawm and Ranger's notion of invented tradition. So, tradition and invented tradition. One way in which tradition might be defined is as a belief accepted without question that is passed on through the generations, particularly the idea that the nation has existed since ancient times and all share a history. However, these beliefs and tales are not necessarily correct, verifiable, or grounded in the careful examination of evidence. National identity is therefore fashioned through collective memory and tradition. One influential theory in this regard is that of invented tradition. It is associated with a 1983 book of essays, The Invention of Tradition, edited by two eminent historians, Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger, and this theory will provide much of the focus for this lecture. Now, these new traditions had a purpose: to foster the idea that all of the people living in the state were part of one nation and had a shared common history stretching back to time immemorial. This invention of tradition is a part of the general collective memory. So, what is collective memory? Writing in the 1920s, Maurice Halbwachs was a French philosopher and sociologist known for developing the concept of collective memory. Halbwachs argued that our personal memories are shaped and influenced by the various groups to which we belong, such as our families and local communities. For example, while he could not remember his first day at school, when witnesses to that event, his parents, described it to him, this artificial construction suddenly takes life and becomes transformed into a remembrance. He argued that such collective memories, or in other words, personal memories influenced by others, have an impact on both individual and group identity. Now, you may wish to examine some of your own distant childhood memories and extrapolate how much is accurately your own memory and how much is given. We will now look at another short clip that introduces some of the issues to be discussed. It's Introduction and 1916.
It's known throughout the world as the Emerald Isle, a land of saints and scholars. But Ireland is undergoing rapid change. Its economy is booming, and its capital is a magnet for revelers. Ireland's future is being reshaped, but so is its past. The evidence can be found on every street corner in Dublin. St Mary's Church was built in 1704. Visitors included John Wesley and Jonathan Swift. Now it's a smart bar and restaurant. The Royal Military Hospital Kilmainham was a refuge for Irish soldiers who'd fought in Britain's colonial wars. Now it's the Irish Museum of Modern Art. What these two early 18th century buildings have in common is not just their architect, Sir William Robinson, but their place in Irish history. They represent British rule in Ireland that lasted from the 12th century until 1922. They're rare survivors too. For much of the 20th century, Ireland had little interest in preserving the architecture of its British oppressors. Nations give away a good deal about their attitude to their own past by how they choose to preserve or ignore their built heritage.
Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom.
The Irish Nationalist Proclamation of the Republic of Ireland, made from the steps of the General Post Office on Easter Monday, 1916. In the fierce battles that followed, the General Post Office and many other buildings in O'Connell Street were destroyed. They weren't the last. By the time the Irish Free State was established by the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1922, war against the British and the Civil War had badly damaged many Dublin landmarks. The Four Courts and the Custom House lay in ruins, and the new...
So, let us now take a look at an overview of nationalism and the practical application of these terms. The Irish nationalist objective was to regain control of the country, creating a nation set apart from English rule. A nation is a collective of people who have a fixed country of origin with shared factors. Hobsbawm theorised that at times when a nation was undergoing transformation, such as the creation of the Irish Free State, society would invent or reinvent traditions to seek continuity with the past, with the nationalists choosing fragments of tradition and history that best suited their cause to rally support. The political and cultural Irish nationalists utilised invented tradition on a selected basis and chose from their ancient and cultural past which parts they believed would achieve the most support for their independence. The term Irish nationalist refers to a series of actions by various individuals and groups, and individuals who all espoused the cause of an Ireland independent from rule from London. According to Anne Lawrence, Daniel O'Connell sought to evoke the spirit of the High Kings, without reference to their violent past. O'Connell looked to use specific symbols of Ireland's ancient past, and later Douglas Hyde endeavoured to reinvigorate the use of a language that was hardly used as a first language. They all contributed to the invention of tradition throughout the struggle for independence for Ireland. It is also necessary to explore how political nationalists and cultural nationalists use these aspects to advance their cause. So, cultural nationalism is a form of nationalism concerned with shared cultural practices of a nation, such as language, dress, and music. Cultural nationalists movements emerged in many countries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and typically presented certain aspects of the past in a romantic and idealised way. This turbulent period of Ireland's past commenced with the Act of Union of 1800 and the abolition of Ireland's Parliament, and concluded prior to the Easter Rising of 1916. Irish traditionalists chose to maintain aspects of their heritage to help develop their sense of cultural identity. In Irish history, it is sometimes difficult to separate tradition from dissent, but to present a certain view of the past for mass consumption. This is not unique and is a quality to be found in many post-colonial societies. The unifying element here is that these aspects are emblematic, their imagery derived from ancient precedents and the power that provided the rhetoric of self-determination as a rallying cry to the Irish nation. However, the selected nature of these symbols also identifies closely with the idea of an invented tradition. Many of the cultural symbols used to promote Irish heritage predated the confiscation of land by the English and Scottish settlers in the 17th century, and even the Anglo-Norman invasion of the 12th century. Anne Lawrence states, the goal that united the cultural nationalists was to establish that the peoples of Ireland had a rich and ancient culture which justified their sense of nationhood. However, keep in mind that nationalism and the national identities on which they rest are not necessarily, are not essential and natural phenomena. but are constructed and constantly subject to manipulation and change. This expression of nationhood by means of the preservation and encouragement of a distinctly Irish folk culture led to the founding of the Nation newspaper in 1842 by Thomas Davis and the Young Ireland group. Young Ireland was a non-sectarian tendency within Daniel O'Connell's Repeal Association, and Davis and Young Ireland went on to found the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Writing about Ireland's Celtic past was a means of educating the Irish people that national independence would bring with it the prospect of moral reform. All eventually play a part of the policy of Gaelicisation, launched in 1921. This included not only language but also teaching of the ancient life of Ireland as a Gaelic state, and the architectural policy of the government and use of the harp as a symbol. The Ancient Monuments Act, which we'll mention a bit more later, of 1929, only protecting buildings predating 1700. So we'll now take a visual look at the Hill of Tara video. That's Tara and O'Connell.
Nowhere embodied the spirit of Romanticism more than the Hill of Tara. It may appear unimpressive, but Tara is the symbolic capital of Ireland, seat of the ancient High Kings, and no one captured its Romanticism better than the 19th century poet and lyricist Thomas Moore. By the middle of the 19th century, Tara had become a nationalist symbol, as well as a symbol of Ireland's romantic past. In 1843, Daniel O'Connell, the architect of Catholic emancipation, held a mass rally at Tara, calling for the repeal of the Act of Union. It was attended by over 500,000 people. A contemporary illustration shows people carrying banners of round towers, Irish wolfhounds and other cultural symbols.
Really, the choice of Tara for one of O'Connell's great monster meetings in 1843 was quite clearly meant to be evocative and meant to identify with the image of the name of Tara. But O'Connell was not a cultural nationalist, and the uses of the past that we associate with cultural nationalism really meant very little to O'Connell. O'Connell's view of the Irish past was simply one of continuous expropriation of the Irish by the English. It was very political and very black and white terms. It was a younger generation of his contemporaries, most notably Thomas Davis, who had this sense of the importance of the cultural things, and clearly supported this kind of expression of nationalism.
In life, O'Connell's supporters surrounded him with Irish cultural symbols. In death, they did the same. O'Connell's heart is buried in Rome, but the rest of his body is buried at Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. The nationalist necropolis opened as a Catholic burial ground in 1832. His grave is marked by the tallest round tower in Ireland. It was designed by the antiquary George Petrie, who appropriated a powerful symbol of early Christian Ireland by basing the tower on the one in Cashel, an important medieval Christian site and seat of a high king. At Cashel, the cathedral had been taken over by the Protestant Church of Ireland in the 16th century and abandoned in the 18th century. But the round tower remained intact. The commanding site and the distinctive shape of the tower represented a brand of Irish Christianity that predated the arrival of the Anglo-Normans in the 12th century.
The preservation of Cashel and such places was I think, always seen as, an obligation on the Irish state. These places too very often had a large popular appeal. For example, sometimes they had religious significance, but also, for example, take Cashel, that is just such a wonderful place that it couldn't but, command, interest. It's a kind of palimpsest, if you like, of so much of Irish history.
The important Romanesque chapel owed a good deal to an architecture brought to Ireland in the 12th century, whose roots were continental rather than English.
Cormac's Chapel is one of the few examples, really, of building that can be seen as distinctively Irish architecture. It has for a long time been seen as this symbolic Irish building, and several churches of various denominations, are modelled on Cormac's Chapel. So that's another reason why Cashel, has this particular importance.
While the monuments of Irish prehistory and early Christianity were being preserved by the new Irish state, those of the Anglo-Irish landed elite were left to decay, condemned by a deep antagonism towards the regime.
Good. I do believe that being able to witness these scenes visually aids our understanding. So, moving on now to the Gaelic League and textual symbology. Founded in 1893 by a group of scholars that included Douglas Hyde, they set about the process of education. Again, it was the evocation of Ireland's past, and specifically through the semiotics of its Gaelic language, which provided the symbolic means for promoting a more culturally and intellectually united Ireland. Unfortunately, the Irish language had gone into decline after the establishment in 1831 of a national system of elementary education using only the English language. It had been further depleted of many participants during the famine of 1845 to 51. Now, the Gaelic League sought to establish a link back to what they argued was a golden age. Furthermore, language is also one of the most useful inroads into any cultural understanding. In 1898, Reverend O'Hickey described it as the only reliable index to the national life of the past. O'Hickey thought the Gaelic language should be a compulsory entry requirement for the National University of Ireland, as the language had been replaced by English in 1831. Yet this statement was powerful, but somewhat unattainable, as during the 800 years since the English invasion, many Irish had ceased to use the language daily, and there were few people who could speak it. Hobsbawm comments about how nations seek to introduce a common national language, and yet it may not be the same language that was spoken in the past, or only spoken by a select few. So not only was Irish not the language of most of Ireland's inhabitants at the end of the 19th century, many in Ireland did not look back to an Irish-speaking history. Let's keep things in context and break off here just to look at an excerpt from a BBC Newsnight documentary concerning the centenary of the Easter Rising. Now, bear in mind, as all good historians should, an inherent bias within the source. The BBC clearly has an establishment British bias, especially towards the end, that slants the evidence. So, the video.
And was it needless death after all? For England can keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead.
In 1921, the poet W.B. Yeats published those words about the most important political event of his lifetime. The Easter Rising of 1916, Ireland's foundational moment. In 1916, with the First World War raging, a ragtag group of rebels and revolutionaries saw an opportunity to strike against the British Empire. Ireland had yet again been promised home rule, but for these men, that simply wasn't enough.
With England distracted with the war on the continent, the First World War, it was seen as an opportune moment at some point during the course of that horrific war, in which 200,000 Irishmen or more had enlisted, by the way, into the British Army, that it would be an ideal time.
On Easter Monday, nationalists seized the General Post Office. Patrick Pearse, one of the rebel leaders, plastered copies of the Irish Proclamation on its doors.
We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible.
The British government quickly dispatched thousands of soldiers. The Sherwood Foresters arrived and thought they were in France, having been training for the war. No one bothered to tell them. So what did they do? What any British soldier in 1916 would do. They built trenches on the roads of the city. There was street fighting. After shelling from a Royal Navy battleship, Dublin was in flames. By Saturday, the rising had been crushed. In the following days, the British government ordered the execution of 15 of its leaders by firing squad. James Connolly's injuries in the battle were so grievous, he had to be shot in a chair. Thousands more, including 77 women, were arrested.
The Irish public opinion initially was very hostile to the rising. But that started to change once the news of the executions broke out. The way the executions were carried out was extraordinarily ham-fisted. It was under the Defence of the Realm Act. There was very strict censorship. It's been well likened by one observer to the Irish public watching the slow seeping of blood from behind a prison door.
1916 is about contested memory and history. 450 people died during the Rising. Thousands of Irishmen died at the Battle of the Somme, only months later fighting for the British Empire, commemorated here at the Irish War Memorial. The truth is, 1916 helped to create and cement the divisions we've known in Ireland for so long. Who should we remember? Those who fought against the Imperial British, or who fought the Germans on continental Europe? That question continues to divide Ireland.
Those who rebelled against the state in 1916 were a tiny minority. They did not command the support even of fellow nationalists. And there's a large degree of antipathy towards them within the unionist community because the rebellion took place at a time when men from all over Ireland, unionist and nationalist, were fighting alongside each other and dying in the bloody mud of Flanders.
All of us, as we try to be reconciled to living together, because we will live together, have to accept that we all have different narratives. We mightn't agree with the other narrative, but it's the sum total of all those narratives. So there are those who will commemorate the Battle of the Somme, and that's fair enough. We have to respect the memory of those who fell. But that was an imperialist adventure.
Among them, President de Valera, the sole surviving commandant of the rebellion. With him, Premier Sean Lemass at these celebrations in Dublin outside the General Post Office where the first shots were fired.
The Rising's 50th anniversary in 1966 was celebrated with bombast and pageantry. Today's perspective of the Rising is more nuanced.
The fact that it caused carnage, that the majority of people killed in the Rising were civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The fact that, although this was very rarely adverted to, the fact that it set the seal on Ulster's separatism, these facts were rather played down.
Independence wouldn't have happened when it did without the Rising. But then, perhaps, the violence to come might not have either.
It began a war of independence, and the legacy of that war of independence includes the partition of Ireland. It includes the question of those who felt they were attending to unfinished business at a much later stage, because obviously a unified Irish Republic was not achieved as a result of 1916 or the War of Independence. And you have the role of violence in the creation of both states, Northern Ireland and ultimately what became the Republic. They're very, very troubling questions. They're very difficult questions to this day.
Someone once said that Britain always looked at Ireland through the wrong end of a telescope, so never understood its people. Now Ireland is turning that telescope unto itself and its own foundations. on this 100th anniversary, it is seeing them anew.
I write it out in verse. MacDonagh and MacBride, and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
So, by 1922, the Irish Free State believed that through Irish language education it would help to socialise its young citizens. Yet, in the years since Ireland's independence, Irish is still only the third most spoken language. The emphasis on language, therefore, risked creating divisions between those who could identify with an Irish-speaking past and those who could not, in a way that the use of more material symbols might not. Nevertheless, post-1922, the Gaelic language became compulsory in schools and the public service. I suppose the benefits of a high-profile Gaelic language presence is likely to be valuable mostly for a ubiquitous cultural pride, rather than any numeric contribution. However, another strand of cultural nationalism was the Anglo-Irish literary revival. W.B. Yeats, a renowned member of this movement, helped to establish the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. The aim of this movement was to reinterpret in English the culture of Gaelic language. Slight shift in emphasis there. Thus, making cultural sense and attempting a reconciliation of the apparent language dichotomy. In this, most colonial societies attempted to re-establish a history of their own. Hobsbawm sees such aspects as national symbols, highly relevant to that comparatively recent historical innovation, the nation. He also describes standard national languages as largely constructs of varying, but often brief age. Given the multicultural linguistic nature of Irish society since the early Middle Ages, the Gaelic League's intentions, although suited to their cause for an independent Ireland, might best be described as idealised. So we have visual symbols and historical fact. Another of Hobsbawm's theories of an invented tradition relates to using symbols to develop a sense of nationhood. Hobsbawm states that the way in which this is done is through social engineering, and it is always innovative. Due to the development of printing methods in the 1840s, the Irish nationalists could widely spread symbols synonymous with ancient history and folklore. However, O'Connell was a lawyer and political nationalist who wanted change through political means. The earliest nationalist within our period also differs from the others in that he was not a cultural nationalist. The architect of Catholic emancipation following the Act of 1829, O'Connell subsequently became one of the 100 Irish MPs at Westminster and devoted himself to campaigning to reveal the Act of Union. In 1843, as mentioned in the video, he used the hill of Tara, a symbolic capital of Ireland, seat of the ancient kings, as the location for a mass rally attended by over 500,000 people, evoking the spirit of the high kings of ancient Ireland and the manufacturing of tradition out of old myths. Of course, many political figures are adept at associating themselves with iconic elements. The nationalist interest in Irish culture and buildings was a form of dissent against the then dominant ascendancy. O'Connell acknowledges the significance of Tara as a place of ancient power in his speech when he states, "We are at the Tara of Kings. We are at the spot where the monarchs were elected." This, however, is only a partial truth, as towards the end of the existence of the High Kings they were appointed by violent rather than legal processes, and none was universally recognised. thus highlighting O'Connell's subjectivity as it is selective in the history he draws upon. He supports a peaceful campaign and ignores the Tara's violent path for political power. Nevertheless, O'Connell's decision to hold a rally at Tara was designed to bring the Irish nationalists together and inspire support for the independence campaign. The success of the plan is clear in the 500,000 people that attended. This supports Hobsbawm's theory that all invented traditions, so far as possible, use history as a legitimator of action and the cement of cohesion. Traditions are not eternal, but are often created and then presented as eternal to support arguments that relate to national identities. The Irish nationalist use of cultural symbols was not simply textual and not just confined to a mythical past or golden age of Ireland. George Petrie was an antiquarian and architect who believed that Irish civilization had been destroyed by the English and that it was essential to understand what had been lost by studying the landscape, place names, bardic writings and antiquities. Although more concerned with visual symbols and historical fact than Young Ireland and the Gaelic Lead, his objectives were similarly educational and enlightening. He shared the aim of cultural nationalists to generate a new age of Irish civilization, but now through the study of the past. Therefore, upon the death of Daniel O'Connell, Petrie was instrumental in the erection of a round tower at Glasnevin Cemetery. This was built to replicate the round towers that had been constructed in early Christian times, and then this became yet another symbol of Irish nationalism. This appropriation of a powerful symbol of early Christian Ireland again conforms to Hobsbawm's contention of an invented historical continuity, albeit that Petrie did set out to separate historical fact from myth. By recognising, protecting and promoting such sites as symbols of Irish freedom within the nation's psyche was a way for the Irish people to demonstrate their forbearance of their heritage and traditions against outside oppression. The Irish nationalist movements between 1800 and 1915 used political and especially cultural symbols drawn from Ireland's distant past to educate the nation and promote the cause for independence. Following the creation of the Irish Free State in 1921, the state wanted to quash memories of English rule, the controversial seizure and redistribution of Irish land in favour of English settlers. In this, land monopoly is a crucial area of historiography. He who controls the land controls the people on it. Following the Irish potato famine of the 1840s and the Land War 1879 to 1882, Irish nationalists drew upon the traditions of ancient Irish agricultural practices and communal landowning to push for land reform and self-government. A significant example of fostering new traditions from old is that of Irish monuments posted post-1916. But initially, two short videos, the first on policy and the GPO, and the second, Dublin in the rubble.
As far as I can see, there is no overt policy. The actions of government can show that there was a policy for rebuilding certain buildings and for not interfering with others and allowing them to decay over time.
The government put Dublin's damaged buildings in the hands of the Office of Public Works. This department of the new Irish state, a survival from British rule, was responsible for rebuilding.
The, if you like, driving force behind the OPW's actions in restoring the four courts, the Custom House and GPO, I would say, was mainly from a functional point of view. That's not to say that they weren't conscious of the history of these buildings and the fact that they were by particularly famous architects. Gandon in the case of the Four Courts and the Custom House, Johnson in the case of the GPO. But there was a degree of functionality, and that is one of the key elements.
The cash-strapped government laid down two key principles for all rebuilding. Firstly, only Irish materials could be used in restoration. The Custom House is a clear example of this. Originally built throughout in Portland stone from England, the reconstructed dome used a darker native Irish limestone. The government's second principle shows the complex relationship between the nationalists and their country's past.
What happens once the rising is put down in about 6 days is suddenly people on the streets with lots of cameras. Because the centre of Dublin, that great thoroughfare now known as O'Connell Street, was one of the great boulevards of Europe. And one of the things the insurgents had sort of banked on was that the British authorities wouldn't bomb property, and boy were they wrong. The entire centre of the city was completely eviscerated at the time.
Are there for you real treasures here?
I particularly like the one of Countess Markovich, the sort of Constance Gorbu, the member of the Anglo-Irish establishment in Ireland, who was radicalised here at the Slade School of Art and went back to Ireland and dedicated herself to Irish republicanism and had herself photographed just before the rising in a uniform she had pulled together and her gun.
There's a photo here which has got numbers. Are these the conspirators?
That's the Cairo gang. They were a group of British intelligence agents who were drafted into Ireland in about 1920 to spy.
Who are these guys marching in bowler hats?
When the case for Home Rule began to gather pace around 1900, the alarm bells went off. And the UVF, is a paramilitary militia, is formed. This was the militia that was to absolutely resist Home Rule at any cost, including violence.
The government restored buildings and monuments they considered historically important to revive their built history. Restoration in Dublin concentrated on buildings such as the GPO on Sackville Street. The steps of the post office hold a significant importance to Ireland's history, as this is where the Easter Rising of 1916 took place, led by Patrick Pearse and James Connolly. So how and why did Irish nationalists strive to establish continuity with a suitable historical past after independence in 1922? To help achieve this, the provisional government issued a proclamation in 1916 stating, "Irishmen and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strives for her freedom." In public statements, nationalists referred to the Catholic religion and pre-Anglo-Irish customs as a way of establishing continuity with the past, concentrating on factors which would bind the country together and to force a divide between themselves and the British. The British executed several nationalists at the forefront of the rising. Therefore, building plans became a material symbol of their martyrdom. This reflected in the building of the GPO. A memorial to the martyrs of 1916 underlines the status of the building. It depicts the mythical Irish hero, Cuchulainn, who bound himself to a tree to hold his courage in the face of death. In a further development of central Dublin in 1924, Sackville Street was renamed O'Connell Street in celebration of Daniel O'Connell, figurehead of the Irish liberation. Under the Irish Monuments Act of 1929, Tara was restored to emphasise its place in traditional Irish culture, along with the historic site of New Grange, the oldest monument in Ireland. New Grange had become quite controversial due to the reconstruction of the site. Instead of stabilising the existing remains, a whole new structure was erected. In contrast to this, nationalists chose to ignore parts of their history. Those buildings that were linked to English rule, such as Dublin Castle and the Royal Hospital at Kilmainham, these only being adopted back into public use in recent history. So there is a movement to and fro between tradition and dissent. We do not have to glorify the colonial past, but rather accept it as a historical fact. The nationalist interest in Irish culture and buildings was a form of dissent against the then dominant ascendancy. As said, many political figures are adept at associating themselves with iconic elements. Why does the Irish leadership now accept these old symbols of foreign rule? Well, firstly, Dublin Post Office has been used in shaping the national past. Interestingly, this building was promptly chosen to be restored, sending a clear message that the rebels may have surrendered to the British. However, they had attempted to break free of British power, making the rebels heroes and having this building as a symbol of rebellion. For the building to be restored correctly, only Irish materials could be used in restoration, in an attempt to remove any British ownership of the building, although the video clip also implies that the cash-strapped government needed economic investment. It also allows Ireland to reclaim the building as part of their national past. Furthermore, Ireland's gratitude in restoration is revealed by dedicating a memorial to the martyrs of 1916, underlying the status of the building. These major changes slowly remove the historical British involvement in this building and replace them with Irish links. The General Post Office now symbolically stands alone, holding a significant place in the building horizon of Ireland. Let's look at another important landmark that assisted in shaping Ireland's national past. Dublin Castle was not fully restored until the early 1960s. Initially, the actions of the government showed that there was a policy for rebuilding certain buildings and not interfering with others and allowing them to decay over time. Dublin Castle was obviously one of those buildings that was left to decay. This is important because as the building was left to decline, it was removing or decaying traces of the participation of Britain's historical involvement with the castle. The castle was the main headquarters for the British troops. By neglecting the castle for a period, Ireland as a country showed independence from Britain. But once the decision was taken to restore the castle, as with Dublin Post Office, all materials would be Irish materials, allowing Ireland to have a stamp of ownership on the castle. This is a characteristic example of the connection between tradition and dissent, as critical of Britain by reclaiming the castle for Ireland and reshaping the historical events linked to Ireland, to the castle. The castle therefore symbolises the invention of tradition. It had once been rejected but is now used to show that the Irish own the castle. This act of rebellion is also dissenting as Ireland uses the original castle but for new purposes that were vastly different to how the British government allowed the castle to function. So let's now go to a short clip concerning the policy revisited.
The government decided to abandon certain buildings. Dublin Castle was one, and the RHK, the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham, was the other. One of them, Dublin Castle, was the seat of British power, and the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham was where the commander of the British troops in Ireland lived. And in the case of Kilmainham, it was used as a kind of a dump for National Museum material. The abandonment of Dublin Castle was a very specific thing. There is nothing written on it, but there is an anecdote that when De Valera came to power in the early 30s, his followers wanted Dublin Castle razed to the ground, and simply to obliterate the memory of the English rule from it. And his reply was that the key should be turned in the gate of Dublin Castle, and it should be left to future generations to decide what happened.
If Dublin Castle and Kilmainham Hospital were abandoned because of their colonial associations, the post office was a potent reminder of Irish martyrdom and was adopted as an emblematic building of the new state. The Office of Public Works undertook a careful and, for its time, lavish restoration completed in 1929. A memorial to the martyrs of 1916 underlines the status of the building. It depicts the mythical Irish hero Cuchulainn, who bound himself to a tree to hold his courage in the face of death. As the post office was nearing completion, the fate of Irish heritage was about to be decided by a national monuments bill introduced into the Irish Parliament, the Dáil.
We have a sacred heritage handed down to us. Every single man with a drop of Irish blood in his veins will remember that the time has come to remember the heroism of our race. And it will be sad that the stones that were erected centuries ago and used by Irishmen would now be used for cowhouses and sheds. God forbid that there should be such a sacrilege.
The parliamentary debates give a revealing insight into the images of Ireland that moved members of the Dáil to speak.
Everybody should be interested in the ancient things of this country, and I believe that every Irishman is. I don't know anything that stimulates more quickly a sense of nationality than a sight of one of these monuments.
I have to say that politicians do tend to use these as emblems for Ireland. They still do. In fact, when Ireland was joining the EU in 1973, the speech by the Minister for Foreign Affairs then, Michael Kennedy, was to the effect that there was a golden age in Ireland, and that we were returning to it in some way by rejoining the Europe that we had been disconnected from when we had these ancient places and sacred spaces.
The Act was framed to protect monuments built before 1700. This immediately safeguarded medieval Christian sites and important Neolithic sites such as Tara and Newgrange. They'd been abandoned and plundered by local authorities and farmers for roads and building materials. Even so, they held a significant place in Irish national consciousness.
They were high on the list of images Irish people have of Ireland. I think most school children would have known about Tara and the High Kings. Most children would have known about Newgrange. And the string of history that Newgrange and Tara give to Ireland is a very important one.
Finally, to focus on how Newgrange in County Meath has assisted in shaping Ireland's past. According to sources, Newgrange tomb is older than the pyramids, emphasising a deep-rooted sense of Irish history. The site also has strong links to Christianity. Throughout Irish history, legend tells us the foundations of Christianity were laid here, underlining religion as continuously present throughout Irish history. It also highlights the point that the Act was framed to protect monuments built before 1700. This immediately safeguarded medieval Christian sites. Obviously, sites like Newgrange are protected, thus allowing Irish culture to be preserved and continue. However, Newgrange has become quite controversial due to the reconstruction of the site. Instead of stabilising the existing remains, a whole new structure was erected. This was controversial since the architect placed a whole new face on the structure without any of the original plans. The architect carried out the reconstruction from the remains of the building that was left. Now, critics point out that Newgrange is in harmony with the various houses built in the 1960s. This could be classed as invented tradition, keeping the original building and using the repetition of architectural history to link it back to the 1960s. Okay, this video clip concerning Newgrange is quite clear on the creation of an edifice to support tradition.
The excavation of Newgrange began in 1967. The principal archaeologist was Professor Michael O'Kelly from Cork University.
Well, the sense of the past that prevailed in the Irish Free State clearly embraced the notion of ancient glory, and there is no doubt at all but that in Ireland as elsewhere that archaeology was driven by this desire to vindicate the national past and national greatness by means of archaeology.
Today, Newgrange is one of the most popular historic attractions in Ireland. And what tourists see and learn about the site is the result of O'Kelly's work. He discovered that the tomb was much older than had previously been thought, even older than the pyramids.
Now, Newgrange was constructed in 3200 BC. It's 5,200 years old, and our date comes from radiocarbon dating, an organic product found on the site.
O'Kelly also discovered that at dawn during the winter solstice, a shaft of sunlight enters the chamber through an opening above the doorway. This makes Newgrange the oldest known astronomically aligned structure in the world.
When we look at Newgrange, this great white wall, this outer facade, it's the most visually striking part of the monument. It's visible for miles on end. Now, this wall is a reconstruction. And as it's a reconstruction, it's also an interpretation, and quite a controversial interpretation at that. Now, many archaeologists believe that this wall did not exist in 3200 BC, that the quartz, which is the white material, and the granite boulders between the quartz made a ceremonial footpath around the perimeter of the site. But Professor Michael J. O'Kelly believed that this wall existed at that time, because when the cairn collapsed, all this material fell into the ground, as I said, as far as we are standing, and that suggested that it stood upright at a point.
Working with an engineer, O'Kelly tried to recapture what the approach to Newgrange must have looked like. From the distribution of stones from the collapsed cairn, they deduced that the surface had been almost vertical. This reconstruction was controversial at the time because the evidence was conjectural. It's controversial today because instead of stabilizing the existing remains, a whole new structure was erected, characteristic of restoration projects in Britain and Ireland during the 1960s.
The reconstruction was the best, I would say, Kelly could have done from what was found, taking the engineering into account and where the material was found. But it has been said, not by me since, that the reconstruction of the facade is very much in harmony with the fronts of various houses built during the 1960s with their stone frontings.
The restoration of Newgrange reflected a strand of Irish nationalism that looked for inspiration in ancient glories. But this devotion to the past was no creation of the new state. Its roots can be traced back to a potent set of sentiments and symbols that surfaced in the 19th century.
In the early 19th century, and especially by the 1840s, the development of print meant that visual symbols of all kinds, come to be much more widespread and much more widely known. And you get depictions of the shamrock and the harp and the wolfhound and the round tower, all of these things being widespread to some extent in books and in newspapers and journals, but also in prints, which come to be found in quite ordinary houses by the 1840s.
The spread of these cultural symbols coincided with the growth in the rhetoric of self-determination. Nationalists were quick to see the power of cultural symbols used for political ends.
I think the question of the roots of an understanding of heritage are in the Romanticism of the 18th and 19th centuries. In Ireland, of course, it was difficult to look for any kind of architectural heritage. We didn't have much, apart from round towers and some Romanesque doorways. But the language and the various emblems, harp, shamrock, and so on, was really the thing that was used by nationalists. But they were feeding out of a very long history of romantic Ireland notions.
Good, I think that's one of the best clips for revealing the invention of tradition. Not that the tradition that's invented isn't genuine, but it's a way of constructing an image of society. Thus with Ireland, the invention of tradition occurs more frequently in societies undergoing rapid transformation. Because a nation needs music, poetry, heroes, and so forth in order to validate itself and to furnish it with the sense of pride and purpose that alone can sustain its independent existence. The selective restoration was an example of invented tradition to achieve continuity with the past, as the Irish did not merely demolish English buildings, but through restoration celebrated Irish architecture and craftsmanship, securing their place in Irish heritage. Dublin's restored Georgian buildings can now command sale prices running into millions of euros. The craftsmanship of the period is highly prized. However, whilst the government sought to find symbols to promote a romanticised view of its heritage through acts of rebuilding and preservation, there was a growing discontent with its reluctance to commemorate those Irishmen who died fighting for Britain during the First World War. After the end of the Second World War, the Irish National War Memorial Park in Dublin eventually opened. Such selected symbols closely match Eric Hobsbawm's thesis that cultural and historical references make up an invented tradition, and are used by nationalists to justify their sense of nationhood and continuity with the past. Ireland is a clear example of how a nation has taken historical buildings and events with an innate and turbulent past, but has adapted them to the modern world. This allows the next generation to engage with both the historical past and indulge itself to future aims. Now, I like this next clip as it puts the substantial global and national events into the context of ordinary life.
How much did war or revolution impinge on how lives were lived? How much did society adapt to or ignore disruption? Did the conventional structures of society break or merely bend under them? Were there other forces that shaped life and how it was lived as much or more than revolution or war? By asking such questions, our inherited and uncritical assumptions about just how violent Ireland was, even how much Ireland was or was not changed by revolution and war, can be challenged. Might we see how little rather than how much Ireland suffered if we see it in the light of how much lives were called on to endure in other countries' experiences of war? If for some, life managed to potter on, what does that ask of our obsessions with the political and military history of this period, of our categorisation of this period by those very terms? And do these kinds of questions contest the grand narratives of war and revolution as being the central experiences of Irish life? Here, an anecdote might help. An elderly woman from the west of Ireland, when asked what she thought about the end of the Great War, replied with a question: what war? Apocryphal as this might be, it should give us something to think about. Crises of war and revolution are surrounded and relieved by all sorts of normalities, going bravely or indifferently on, regardless of what might be falling apart around them. Combatants of all kinds still had their hearts broken, their hopes dashed, still found Charlie Chaplin funny when he fell down, still knew that there were new hats to buy, new songs to sing. Indeed, civilians or soldiers may have lived all the more intensely because of what war or revolution might at any moment bring. By looking at social lives lived in war's midst, we might see people as more than just soldiers or civilians or casualties of war. Looking might show us what people fought to protect, might show us what they longed to return to when all the fighting was done.
Conversely, an interesting area for research debate would be to examine the negativity that tradition invention brings. For example, Hitler had an idea for tomorrow, and with Goebbels was a master of propaganda if his traditional inventions had been successful. Imperial culture has superseded many traditions in Britain, but with different levels of success in England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. I believe the lesson to take from them is that nationalist claims of uniqueness generally melt into a much more complicated and nuanced set of interacting relationships. However, I'll leave these two ideas to your own private studies. Many thanks, and see if you can compete with the mastermind and successfully answer these questions.
And our next contender, please. And your name is?
John Savage.
Your occupation?
Salesperson.
And your chosen subject?
The Easter Rising.
In 90 seconds, starting now. Podrick Pierce read a proclamation declaring Ireland's independence on Easter Monday 1916 outside the building where the Republicans made their headquarters. Which building?
The GPO.
Yes, many of the rifles used by the Republicans had been landed at Howth 2 years earlier on the Asgard, a yacht belonging to an English-born Irish nationalist author. Who was he?
Childers.
Yep, Erskine Childers. What was the name of the Republican commandant of Dublin's 1st Battalion, which was stationed in the Four Courts area of Dublin?
Eamon Kenn.
No, Daly. Eamon de Valera, the commandant of the 3rd Battalion, made his headquarters during the rising at a bakery on the corner of Grand Canal Street. What was it called?
Boland's Mill.
Yep. What was the name of the Brigadier General who commanded the British troops at the Curragh?
Low.
Yes. From which building, owned by the strikebreaker William Martin Murphy, did the Republicans fly the Starry Plough flag?
The Imperial Hotel.
Yes, on the Wednesday morning following the rising, which British gunboat sailed up the Liffey and began to shell Republican positions?
Helga.
Yes. In which town in County Meath was a successful attack made on a Royal Irish Constabulary barracks in the only large-scale fighting outside Dublin?
Ashmore.
Yep. The Republican surrender to the British forces on Saturday, the 29th of April 1916, was delivered under the protection of a white flag by a nurse who was a member of the Irish Republican Women's Paramilitary Organisation. What was her name?
Elizabeth Farrell.
Yep, all of the signatories to the Proclamation of Independence were executed after they surrendered in the aftermath of the rising. How many signatories were there?
7.
Yes, which Republican leader was executed by a firing squad on the 12th of May 1916 while he was tied to a chair because he'd been badly wounded during the rising?
James Connolly.
Is correct. No passes, John? 10 points.
Okay.